Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. About 8 years ago, I came to the same room, the amphitheater here at the Ottawa Hospital, to a similar talk. So my mom was out of town and I was going home on weekends to help her and my dad. She had advanced Parkinson's, and I was also still working full-time. So I walked out of the talk that day and I thought, you know what, I'm really experiencing caregiver stress and I need to do something to change my coping. I was just trying to survive the situation without really paying attention to my own health and to see how that was impacting me. So I was ignoring those warning signs. So it is my hope today that you will also gain something from this talk to help battle the struggles with caregiver stress, given whatever role you play in this subject area. So I do have a disclaimer. I'm the co-author of this Coping Strategies Program Manual. It contains theoretical models and evidence related to teaching coping strategies, along with over 30 coping strategy modules and 80 handouts to provide with clients. Should any copies of the book be sold as a result of the presentation today, I'd receive royalties. You need to step in? No? Okay. And I just want to welcome my co-author, Mary McNamara, is here today in the audience, so thanks for coming. So why teach coping strategies to caregivers? You can see from this slide that there are a lot of people that find themselves in that caregiving role for older family members. Caregiving can have a significant toll on mental health and on your overall function. And we do want healthy caregivers because it really makes a difference to senior care and to our healthcare budgets. So when we teach coping strategies, it empowers the caregivers and assists them to advocate for their own needs. The learning objectives include the 4 categories of coping. So I'm going to overview coping category content. Kolb's adult learning cycle, because it relates to improved coping strategy training. And finally, some specific coping strategy topics that I think are really relevant to meet caregiver needs. The agenda is going to follow the learning objectives. So it's always good to start by looking at what the research is saying in terms of what caregivers would benefit from. So a systematic review pointed to a strong evidence for providing caregivers with a spectrum of interventions. Training in communication skills, mindfulness, and cognitive reframing were some of the topics that they covered to improve caregiver quality, like confidence, self-efficacy, and reduce overall burden. And I'm going to talk about these topics a little bit later on in this talk. Also, it said that professionals that lead support groups will enhance caregiver quality of life. So it's my hope today that this talk is going to give you some tools to enhance coping strategy training by looking at content to include and a process method to follow. Remember that the research suggests multi-component psychoeducation interventions are important. So there's a lot of coping strategy content out there, and it can be really daunting to figure out where should we focus our efforts. So I thought to make this a little bit easier. Yes, I'll continue, okay. So to make this easier, we'll examine how regular use of strategies and coping categories contributes to managing stress. So the 4 categories include health and wellness, changing the situation, changing the body's response to stress, and changing attitude. Let's start with the first one. Whoops. There we go. So there's a direct connection between change and stress. Increased change is going to increase our stress level. And healthy routines are one way to reduce stress because it reduces change. It's also important to follow these healthy routines because it keeps us best prepared to manage with the daily demands that we face. So here, strategies can include regular sleep, exercise, and nutrition, having good social connections, limiting our substance use, and ensuring that our leisure and spiritual needs are met. So often we know that these factors are important to our overall health, but we might not be committed to choosing these kinds of healthy routines. The second category is changing your situation. So the stress experience increases when we feel a lack of control in the situations. And though we can't control all sources of stress, like having a loved one diagnosed with dementia or dealing with a traumatic loss, or even preparing for an upcoming family event like a family wedding. Though we can't control all sources of stress, there are a surprising number of ways that we can control our stress habits. So when we have poor habits like procrastination, or engaging in needless worry, or saying yes to things just because we don't want to have that guilt feeling, these are things that we can really gain some more control and skill over. Strategies like goal setting, assertiveness training, and time management are the key strategies under this category of changing the situation. We want to know our limits and say no, be able to ask for help when we need it, and set a goal that has a good chance for success. So the third category is changing the body's response to stress. So most of you are aware of this response. It'll include symptoms like rapid breathing, rapid heart rate, difficulty sleeping and eating. And when we experience these symptoms, it's really hard to reason and problem solve. So we want to have some strategies to reduce those symptoms. Now, the first essential step of this, of course, is recognizing that those symptoms are occurring. If we leave them unchecked, we're more likely to go into stress exhaustion. This is how I would differentiate between knowing our early warning signs of stress and our stress exhaustion symptoms. In early warning signs, we're still functioning, but the stress symptoms are present, whereas in exhaustion, we're no longer really able to do the things that we need and want to do in our day. Once you know those early symptoms, then you'll be able to step in and do things like relaxation techniques, mindfulness, or talk to people about the things that are distressing you. Now, just a little side note, this is very different from your health and wellness routines. In your health and wellness, you might very well be able to eat and sleep, but you're choosing not to. So you might choose, if you're under stress, to binge Netflix until 2 a.m. or eat your popcorn for supper. In stress exhaustion, you're likely having difficulty eating and sleeping because of poor appetite or insomnia. So we're on to the fourth category of coping, which is changing attitude. So there's a strong connection between what we think and how we feel. Negative thoughts are going to fuel the intensity of distressing emotions. So the main strategy here is to recognize those negative thoughts and replace them with more neutral or a positive outlook. But it's not always so easy to recognize these thinking traps, because when we're in them, they really seem like they're fact-based. I'll give you a few examples. So a thinking trap could be black and white thinking, like, no one's going to be able to help me with this situation. Or predicting a negative outcome. If I tell them how I feel, they're going to see me as weak. Or another one is emotional reasoning. I feel guilty taking time for myself, so I must be a selfish person. If we want to be able to recognize that these are distortions and replace them with more compassionate or reasoned thinking. So other strategies here would be to give ourselves credit for the good things we've done, or to count our blessings, for example. So I've just given you an overview of the 4 categories of coping and some of the content related to strategies under each of those categories. Now I'm going to relate them to a couple of case studies, and just so you know, the information has been changed in order to protect confidentiality. So the first person is CB, or caregiver burnout. This middle-aged female was recently widowed and retired. She was a caregiver for her ill husband for about a year before he passed away, her elderly father who was living in his own home. She had a teenage child and an ill mother-in-law in a retirement home. She presented with poor sleep and appetite, and she wasn't even able to do her regular self-care. She was really in high distress. There was lots of crying spells, really felt too anxious to leave her room, did not want to engage in goal setting. In her mind, she was like, well, what's the point? I'm so ill, I'm never going to be able to get back to doing the things I need to do. And she had withdrawn from her friends, thinking that if I reach out to them, they're not going to understand, or I'm going to bring them down as well. So there was a lot of black and white thinking present. And even if she made a small gain, like getting to the dining room for a meal, she downplayed it with a yes, but it's not enough. Like it's really not making a difference in the big picture. So I'm going to relate how we looked at the 4 coping categories and how we addressed her recovery. So first of all, under health and wellness, it was important for her just to start committing to those basic routines again. So to attend to meals, even if it was only to eat one thing off her tray, and that would get her walking in the hallway a bit to get out of her room. She wasn't keen on medication, but she did agree to discuss some sleep aids with her physician. Under changing the body's response to stress, we offered her a relaxation group, but initially that wasn't working very well. She was still, frequently crying. She was agitated, so it was hard to settle. But knitting really did help her. So she'd been a knitter in the past, and she found that this kind of repetitive activity was soothing for her, and it helped her connect a little bit with others. Now, when she came to that group and was knitting, there was still a lot of that crying and kind of drawing attention to how bad her situation was. So I had to talk with her about really being mindful in that group. It was her job in that group to really focus on the knitting and to start looking at what other people were doing in the group, just to start giving herself some rest from the negative ruminations in her head and give her a better chance for recovery. Under changing the situation, we started with really small and SMART goals for change. So a SMART goal is a specific, measurable, acceptable to her, realistic, and with a time frame. So she agreed to shower every second morning as a way to get more active in the mornings. And finally, under changing attitude, I asked her to intentionally look for positives. So if she was out walking, maybe a color that she liked or something that she noticed that was somewhat pleasant for her. And again, this was just a way to break that rumination on the negatives going on in her life. She actually embraced that one and started to initiate conversation with other people in the group, so I was pretty pleased with the effort she made. As she was getting better, so she's less distressed, so you can see that the problem solving is coming back in the reasoning. So she was able to commit to a more basic daily schedule, which got her exercising off the unit, moving up to showering every day, and following a regular sleep and wake time. In changing the body's response, by this time she was a regular at relaxation group, and she was able to start practicing it off the unit before she went to bed and when she went on weekend passes. Under changing the situation, we talked about setting up some more support for her father. She had to start setting some limits with the amount of assistance she provided to him. So for that, we used something called a desk script, and I'll show that in a moment. And under changing attitude, she needed to identify and reframe cognitive distortions related to connecting with her friends. So again, she's better now, so she's able to understand what the distortions look like and able to poke some holes in those distorted facts or those distorted thoughts. Before she left, she said, "I'm so much better now. I've got my life back, and I'm remembering to take care of me first before I can take care of others." Isn't that a key for a caregiver, isn't it? So this is a desk script. So there's 4 steps to this, and this is really helpful to use in emotionally charged situations. Basically, you describe the facts, express your feelings, you state your needs, and then you state the consequences or the compromise. So we wrote this out, and she had this conversation with her father. "You've asked me to help with housework and pay bills. I'm feeling overwhelmed with all my responsibilities. I need you to help me find other options and support managing your house and your finances. And that way I could focus on my recovery." So you see how the consequence is directly related to if her needs are met. And so then the father did agree to hiring some cleaning help, and he was also agreeable to try the online banking, so she helped him set that up. The second case study is CS, or caregiver stress. This was a middle-aged married male who was employed. He was giving daily visits to his parent, who was in long-term care, had a high-stress job, and there was an upcoming major family event. He presented with poor sleep 2 weeks before he was admitted, and he started getting very paranoid at work. He was continuing to eat well and exercise, and he liked to be busy, so he was quite activated during the day. He did have difficulty saying no to others, so that left him with really high productive roles between his work and outside of work time, and he didn't have much downtime. And he expressed feeling guilt and loss over his father's move to long-term care. So right away, once the paranoia settled down a little bit, we could get him into all of our coping strategies groups. And we started with the health and wellness, so setting up a schedule on discharge that reflected a greater balance between self-care, productive, and leisure occupations. We looked at changing his body's response to stress. So it was key here for him to recognize what his early warning signs were and the paranoia as more of a burnout sign. And we also taught him the Benson's relaxation technique, which is a technique where you repeat the word one every time you breathe out. And it's pretty effective to stop, bringing the ruminations to the maximum catastrophic end. So he really liked the Benson's technique. In changing the situation, he decided that he was getting ready to start considering retirement. And as the first step, he was going to have a conversation with his wife about what their budget was and when they could make retirement happen. And finally, under changing attitude, he was able to recognize thought distortions. So we did a lot of education on what thought distortions look like and what more rational questioning would be. And that, he found, really changed things around for him. He recognized that he was using a lot of thought distortions, and being more compassionate towards himself was going to be really important. So remember that at this point, the paranoia had settled down, and so he was realizing that even when he was well, he was often a person to jump into the negative distortions. So one of the modules that we look at when we're trying to help people with understanding and replacing thought distortions, it looks something like this. So you start with scenario with the facts only. So his father had moved into long-term care, and he was feeling guilt, sad, and shame. So we had to look at what were the thoughts behind that. And he came up with, I should be visiting him more. I'm really being selfish with my own time. He was able to recognize that the distortion here was minimizing the good that he was doing, and he was labeling himself as selfish, which is a black and white type of thinking. So it doesn't end here. He needs to come up with a more constructive thought and a more constructive action when these thought ruminations start happening. So he said I'd have regular contact with him and keep him updated on the news of the family. That was a more realistic thought. And the constructive action was to identify one positive experience from each of the visits. So I've given you an overview of the content related to 4 coping categories, and then related it to 2 case studies. Likely you've got some familiarity with some of these coping strategies, but when there's a gap between coping need and actual coping strategy use, this is an opportunity for learning. So we can't really look at managing caregiver stress if we don't look at how we're going to teach them those strategies to help them. And as busy health professionals, like we know we're busy, and we can imagine that our caregivers are also extremely busy. So we want to find a strategy that is going to be efficient, so that when we put the time into teaching the strategies, the learning actually sticks. And that's what we're going to look at in a couple of minutes. So whenever you do any type of learning, the first step is to figure out what is your learning objective. And this happens in 3 domains. So you could have a knowledge-based learning objective where you ask the person to recall the information, for example, like list the schedule of your medication. You can have skill-based learning objectives where you want them to show that they have learned it. So this could be they demonstrate to you or they perform the learning. And finally, you want an affective learning objective. So this is more along the lines of that they actually value and commit to the new learning. So for example, my example here is commit to delegating yard work to a service provider. So you might know that there are service providers out there that provide yard work duties. You might be able to get onto your computer and look them up and find contact information. That would be a skill-based learning objective. But the key that's preventing you from doing the new learning is that you just don't think you should spend the money, or you feel obligated to be doing it yourself. And so if you don't have that buy-in to the new learning, the chances of it happening are not going to occur. So that's why we look at learning in 3 domains. I'm going to guess that many of you here are involved in some type of teaching. And perhaps you've used some of these methods, like giving a handout or providing verbal information or giving a demonstration, and then just kind of hope that that learning was cemented. But these experiences alone do not guarantee that the learning is going to happen. We have to include other steps. So just because you see or hear something doesn't mean you're going to learn it. So for example, how many of you have been a passenger in a car and you're looking around while you get to your new destination, but when you get there, you have no idea really about the route you took. So you've seen it as you were driving, or the GPS has told you how to get there, but you really haven't learned the route. So we need to have some other strategies in place. Oh, sorry. So you saw the route. You don't necessarily know how to get there, but this is often what we'll do as healthcare professionals, or just in general when we're trying to teach other people things, is we'll give them the verbal information or we'll give them something to read and then just hope that that learning sticks. Okay. So I'm going to show you what this looks like for the Kolb's learning model. So this is an adult learning model, and it can take us through a process when we're trying to teach new information. So it starts with an experience where something will happen. This could be your handout, your verbal information, or your demonstration. And then it moves on to reflection, generalization, and application. Remember, we're always starting with a learning objective. So before you do your teaching, it's good to know what are you hoping that your outcome will be. Once you've given them that experience, you're going to do a reflection phase where you ask them, what did you notice? What stood out for you? How did you feel about this? And with that part, you're able to top up when you see any gaps in what they should have noticed in the experience. In the generalization phase, you will ask questions to help them abstract the concepts and to make it a bit more personal and relevant to their own situation. So you might ask things like, so what's the significance of that? Or what would be the pros and cons of using this approach and why? And then you'd finish with an application piece where they would apply some type of the new learning. So that's part of the adult learning cycle. Before they leave the session, you want to provide an evaluation to make sure that that learning has occurred. If they leave that session and the learning hasn't happened, then the chances of transferring it to their own environment are much smaller. So I'm going to take you through an example of what this looks like. So this is one of our modules on recognizing personal symptoms of stress. So I often use this with people who are coming in with a first suicide attempt. For me, I really want them to know before they leave the hospital what their early and exhaustion warning signs were, and what professionals or supports they will talk to if those symptoms reoccur. So it starts with an experience. And just give me a second here. I've got to... just going to show some handouts. Okay, so it starts with an experience. We'll give them a handout which is loaded with different symptoms you can have related to stress, and they go through and they check all that they have noticed in themselves lately. Then you move to the reflection. So what did you notice? Well, I'll often hear that they've got lots of symptoms, or they have symptoms in particular categories, maybe like physical and cognitive. And then we move on to more of a generalization phase. So here what I want them to conclude or to start to abstract is that there is a difference between early and exhaustion symptoms. So I might ask, how would you differentiate? And what I'm looking for from them is that in early signs, they're still functioning, but the symptoms are present. And in exhaustion, they're not able to do the things that are important to them, and they probably need to seek professional help. So you can see that with a first suicide attempt, you want them to recognize that if they're having suicidal thoughts, that's a key to let other people know and to seek professional help. In the application phase, I'm going to ask them to come up with 3 signs for each. So remember that first handout, that's a very busy handout. They could have a lot of symptoms, and it's not a very workable document. So here they streamline and choose 3 early warning signs, 3 exhaustion signs. And in the evaluation phase, I ask them to commit to sharing that with a support person. So it could be a friend or family member, and it's also encouraged that they share it with a professional support. So now remember, as healthcare professionals or just even general learning, we often will just give them that experience. We'll tell them something or show them something and then expect them to be able to do it. And you think, okay, so what could go wrong if I just go with that experience and get them to do it? Well, let me show you. So this photo is a result of myself not following the adult learning model. This is already after I'd done my diploma in adult learning. So I asked my husband to help me with the vacuuming, and I told him that he'd need to empty the canister between floors. So he asked me how to do that, and I thought, you know what, this is a smart guy. He should be able to figure it out. But I was generous. I got the canister off the vacuum, I handed it to him, I said, you just have to push the red button. So he's looking at it, oh, the red button. Oh yeah, here it is, and he pushed it. Well, here we go. This was the result. Just anybody see how close that garbage can is to the pile of dust on the floor? So when I told my colleague, Mary, I said, you know, my husband is so inept. She said, it wasn't his fault, it was your fault. You didn't follow the ALM. I thought she's absolutely right. I went by giving him an experience, so some partial verbal information, and I expected him to know to empty it into the garbage can. So anyways, we got through that. I think in the end, I ended up cleaning up all that mess because I was pretty fuming. But with some persistence, we did get there, and now he's semi-regular at vacuuming. But I think it's a really nice illustration of how we lost a lot of efficiencies by just not following a few extra steps. It would have taken less time, actually, if I'd done that. But I don't want you just to take my word for it. There's a lot of studies out there that show how experiential learning does empower people, especially when they're having to self-manage chronic issues or conditions. So when you use experiential learning, it really empowers the client. It empowers them, it promotes self-awareness, and it increases their awareness of where their personal control lies. I'm just going to show you, this is a manual out of our book. It is a lot to know all the coping category content, and then to also figure how do I put this process into an adult learning model, because it's really the activities and the questions that you use that will promote the learning for the person. So we have it all laid out here, including what the stages of learning are and the things that you would say and do as a facilitator, as well as what you're looking at from your learner to ensure that the learning is happening. It's set up to run in groups, but it's very easy to adapt to one-on-one. It's just a matter of following the same adult learning process. Whoops, I think I went too fast. And these are the handouts that go with that particular module on developing healthy and balanced routines. Mostly the handouts play some part in that learning model process. This is just, I put this slide in because I thought it was a little bit clearer to see how the manual is set up. Okay, so let's look now at specifically with our caregivers. Remember, there's a lot of content out there on coping strategies, so let's figure out where do we start with our caregivers. And every caregiver is going to have unique ideas of what their priorities are for occupations that they need and want to do in their day. And when we look at occupations, we're looking at things that they do for their self-care, productivity, and leisure. So these are two modules that I think are a good starting point. They can let you figure out very quickly where the person is struggling and what's going well, and they can take some ownership in what do they prioritize as needing change. So the first one is doing what's important to me, and it's a checklist of occupations under self-care, productivity, and leisure. So they check off things that they are struggling with. So whether that's eating nutritious meals, managing the cleaning at home, or having active recreation. The second one, from that, then you would prioritize and goal set from some of the issues that they identify as problems. The second one is 4 categories of coping. So I've talked about that already, but this is actually, you've got the 4 categories laid out, and then there's a bunch of coping strategies that would fall under each of the categories. And they do a self-assessment. So they rate themselves as never, rarely, sometimes, or regularly doing these different coping strategies. And you're not looking for them to do all the coping strategies, but you do want them to have strategies in each coping category, because we know from the earlier slides that this does make a difference to a well-rounded coping repertoire. Then I think, regardless of what their priorities are, I think these 4 modules are really key in basic understanding and managing of stress. So the first one is building healthy routines. under the category of health and wellness. Under the category of changing the body's response, it's really recognizing those stress symptoms. Caregivers, I think, well, from my own experience and from people that I've worked with in caregiving stress and burnout, they are just trying to survive their situation, so they ignore those early signs. Under changing the situation, you want to have some assertiveness strategies, especially for saying no and refusing requests. And finally, under the changing attitude, you want to know the connection between the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors. So I've put the next few slides have modules related to each of these specific coping strategy topics. The first one is committing to a daily schedule. So we know that just as an orientation for the individual, a basic schedule is going to ensure some predictability in your routines in the day, and with that predictability, it will reduce your stress. The idea here again is looking after yourself before you need to look after others. So they would complete a daily maintenance checklist, so it includes things like regular healthy meals, exercise, contacting a social support. There's a list of different things. They go off and decide which ones do they think are going to be important for their health and their recovery. Then you would ask a reflection question like, which items on this checklist are new to you, and what are you already doing well? Moving on to generalization, it's something along the lines like there's a difference between making a plan and sticking to it. Don't we know that? So we could say, what's a barrier that you might face, and how would you get yourself unstuck? And they'd finish by plotting out a daily basic routine. So this is what I would call their skeleton routine. It's from about 6 in the morning till 9 at night or 10 at night, and they put in their routine. So that's like a skeleton. Not every time slot is filled, but they put in the things that they don't want to change too much from day to day. As an evaluation, you're going to ask them, what are you going to do with this schedule now that it's done? Like, how are you going to remember to use it? And you're looking for things like maybe they would post it somewhere or share it with other family members. The second one is, of course, recognizing those stress symptoms. We've talked about this one earlier, so I won't go into any more detail here. The next one is the assertiveness formula. So that desk formula that we talked about earlier is great for when you are asking for things, but you also want to know how to refuse requests. And you want some strategies to help stand your ground if you have somebody that's requesting who's pretty persistent. So we know that setting limits was going to promote boundaries and promote healthy relationships with others. So being able to set limits with other people actually is really good for getting some control over our lives and encouraging those healthy relationships. In the experience, you would give them, we'd go over some guidelines for refusing requests and introduce the desk formula. In the reflection, a really nice question is, how do you feel about saying no? Under the generalization, you could ask, what keeps us from saying no to unwanted requests? And what would be strategies for standing our ground? So here we're going to introduce a little bit of top-up information, like the broken record technique, fogging, or content to process shift. I'm not going to go into all of those, but just the broken record technique is very simple. You just keep repeating your answer to the person who's requesting. So, no, I'm not interested in that. No, I'm not interested in that. No, I'm not interested in that. Eventually, they'll give up, or you'll go into the desk formula to talk about how they keep asking you that question. I'm starting to feel really uncomfortable. I need you to stop asking me to do this, and that way I think it would be better for our relationship. Something along those lines. In the application piece, you just give them like a sample scenario and get them to practice a strategy for saying no and for avoiding manipulation. But in the evaluation piece, now you're going to get them to choose a personal situation that they want to set limits in, write out their script for how they would say no, and choose a strategy to stand their ground. And then we have the fourth category, which remember is changing attitude. And a specific strategy under this is knowing the thought, feeling, and behavior connection. And to orient your client to this, or your caregiver to this, you could say something along the lines like, sometimes, especially when we're under stress or having a lot of difficulty, we can fall into that trap of negative thinking. There's a close relationship between what we think and how we feel. And so if we have thoughts that are very negative, we're going to have more distressing emotions like anxiety or anger or depression. So the experience is just giving an overview of this, how this process works, that connection between thinking, feeling, and behavior, and information on thought distortions. So we've got a list of 12 with examples that talks about, that helps them to recognize what's the language in a thought distortion. Then in reflection, how would you explain the handouts in your own words? Under generalization, you could ask, what's the difference between a negative thought and being realistic? And what happens when our emotions, what happens with our emotions given a specific distortion? So for example, in this polarized thinking or black and white thinking, it's going to lead to more extreme emotions like hopelessness or feeling overwhelmed. In the application piece, you could give them a distortion, or you could give them a scenario and get them to identify a distortion and the feelings that might be related to that, and ask them to replace it with a more balanced or compassionate thought. So first, it's a little bit more removed from them because you're just giving them a scenario. But finally, in the evaluation piece, they choose a negative thought that they've been dealing with, and they look at the feelings that it's causing and are asked to replace it with a more compassionate statement that they can use towards themselves. Okay, so just a quick, how am I doing for time? Great. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a personal scenario to show how this, how my own experience relates to these specific 4 coping strategies that I've talked about under the different coping categories. So last April, I had the joy of my son moving back home after 4 years of university. He was completing his degree in engineering physics. And he came home and he said, I'm almost done. I just have to I just have one more thing to do. I have to complete my final paper. I thought, well, okay, final paper, this is something you should have been working on all year, but maybe you're almost there. So I said, great. I said, so how far are you? And he says, well, I just have to write it. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to see him walk across that stage and graduate. So I thought, okay, he's going to be home for about a month, and I'm going to have to really work on my health and wellness routines. And I'm pretty good at doing that, so I gave myself a little happy face for that. And then I thought, I better let him know how I'm feeling about this. So I said, I'm coming home from work every day, and I'm asking how you're doing with your major paper, and you're not really telling me that you're spending a lot of time on it, and I'm starting to feel really anxious about you completing it on time. I need you to dedicate some time to it every day, and that way I'd feel a lot better. He said, well, that's all good and fine, Mom, but I'm pretty stressed about it too, and really you have to manage your own emotions because I got enough on my plate. I thought, okay, he's right. I've said my part, but really this is his thing to figure out. So I decided to, be a little more subtle in my request if he was doing his paper or not. Then one day I came home and I said, so how was your day? And he said, oh, I had a great day. I thought, yes, here it is. He's made great progress. He said, yeah, I spent 3 hours today teaching my dog his left from his right. I thought, okay. So I thought, I thought, well, no matter how much effort I put into it, I am not willing to put a positive attitude on my dog knowing his left from his right. And that's when I decided to take up running. So I don't love running, but I had to figure out a way to manage my emotions. And for the next 3 weeks, running and I became pretty good friends. He actually did finish his paper, and we saw him walk across the stage. So our relationship remained intact, and we all had a positive outcome. Okay, so let's continue then. So remember, I've talked a lot about this adult learning model. Time for you to participate in it with me. All that information I gave you is part of the experience. I've talked to you about the process model and the content that we use for coping strategy training. So I want you just to take a moment to either answer in your head or jot down on your paper. What's one part of this presentation that was most interesting for you? And what was a piece of information that was new to you? Later on, if you want to share that at the mic, you can. Oops. Okay, so just have you had a chance to reflect on that. Next is a generalization component. So how is this experience today significant for you? So what's a coping category that you'd like to add to your current practice with caregiver education, and why? So remember those categories. Are you addressing health and wellness, changing body's response, changing situation, or changing attitude? And what strategy could help you name the 4 parts of the learning cycle? So that adult learning model that we use, what's a strategy to remember the 4 parts? I'll let you know that what we learned in the adult education course that I took was ERGA. So ERGA just lets you remember experience, reflection, generalization, and application as a way to really cement the learning. Under application, I'm going to read through them, and you can just put a show of hands if there's one of these that you think would be interesting for you as a result of this presentation. One item that you would follow up on. So inputting reflection and generalization questions in my practice when educating others. How many of you think you might be willing to do that? Okay. Consider the 4 coping categories and identify a personal need for growth. We're all probably in caregiving roles, so that might be relevant. Consider the 4 coping categories and identify an area for growth in my program. How many of you think you might be willing to do that? And finally, there's a section for other. Okay, now it's evaluation time. So name the 4 coping categories. Anybody want to shout them out? Health and wellness. Another one? Change your body's response. Change your situation. And the last one? Change your attitude. Okay, great. You passed. All right, now name a process model to enhance learning. So what's that model called that I talked about today, or how would you remember it? I can see some of you flipping back through your handout. That's encouraging. Anyone? Oh, it's not boding well for my evaluation piece. So it's your adult learning model, ALM. ERGA is a cycle that we follow. And okay, I think I should get good audience participation in this one. Caregivers benefit from a spectrum of caregiver interventions. True or false? True. Okay, that one got buy-in for. All right. So in conclusion, caregivers do need strategies in 4 coping categories. Coping strategies will empower your caregiver because it emphasizes control, choice, and responsibility for personal wellness. And following the process of Kolb's adult learning model, or ERGA, to teach coping strategy content is effective and efficient. Here are my references, and that opens it up to questions and comments. So thank you very much, everybody.